What if the truth comes knocking? 10 years too late. In 1998, a letter reached the governor of Texas, written by a man haunted by a murder he committed a decade earlier. His words reignited a case that had long been considered closed, and what followed was a shocking unraveling of lies, manipulation, and injustice. 2 innocent men had been imprisoned, their lives shattered by a coerced confession and a justice system too eager for resolution. One would never recover. The other would fight to become a voice for the voiceless. Let's uncover the chilling truth behind the Nancy DePriest case and the man who finally couldn't stay silent. In February 1998, a visitor arrived at the office of the then governor of Texas. The visitor was a criminal who wanted to confess and cleanse his soul. He had been writing letters to the police and the prosecutor's office since 1996, trying to reach out for 2 years, but all his attempts had been ignored. Eventually, he decided to write directly to the governor. In his letter, he confessed to a crime far more serious than robbery or abuse. Over 4 pages, he detailed the murder of a girl named Nancy DePriest, which he had committed in 1988. He urged the governor to take his confession seriously, stating that he had become religious and wanted to come clean. 2 men had already been imprisoned based on statements related to a crime they did not commit. Both were falsely accused and unjustly convicted. During the investigation, it emerged that these 2 young men had confessed to the murder, while the true killer, feeling remorseful, watched their lives being destroyed. He believed their wrongful convictions were the result of police pressure, which he himself had managed to evade. In 1998, this criminal wrote another letter to the prosecutor's office, confessing once again to the murder of the young girl and providing numerous details that only the actual murderer would know. The letter caught the governor's attention, leading to the reopening of the case files. The man's guilty conscience had grown too heavy to bear. Police began re-examining all case materials and soon discovered many inconsistencies. The story of the murder began in 1988. On the morning of October 24th, around 9:30 a.m., the restaurant administrator arrived on Rint Street in Austin, Texas, to check on her employee, Nancy, who had not answered the phone. Nancy, a manager, was supposed to arrive early to prepare the food. Her husband had driven her to the restaurant that morning at 7:40 a.m. before heading to work. According to the restaurant's schedule, Nancy's last contact with the owner was at 8:30 a.m., when she placed an order for ingredients that were running low. When the owner called her at 9 a.m. to check if they were ready to open, Nancy did not answer. Repeated calls went unanswered. Concerned, the owner went to the restaurant herself. Upon arrival, she found the back door unlocked, water spilled on the floor, and the mixer still running. Everything was eerily quiet, and Nancy was nowhere to be seen. The owner continued to search and eventually found Nancy in the bathroom, surrounded by her own blood. Her head was severely injured, and her eyes were glassy and unfocused. She was still alive, but her wrists were tied with her own bra. In a panic, the owner immediately called for an ambulance. Paramedics arrived quickly, found Nancy still alive, and rushed her to the hospital. Doctors did everything they could to save her, but her injuries were too severe. After careful consultation with the medical team, Nancy's family made the heartbreaking decision to remove her from life support. They chose to donate her organs, believing that Nancy would have wanted to help save the lives of others. Forensic experts discovered that Nancy had been violently abused before being shot in the back of the head. DNA evidence was collected from the crime scene and sent to a lab for analysis. Investigators initially believed the motive for the murder was robbery, as the cash register from the previous day was missing. The year before, multiple pizzerias in the Austin area had been robbed. Those incidents occurred late at night or after business hours, and there had been no injuries, abuses, or murders. The thieves had focused solely on stealing cash from the registers and the business's earnings. Nancy's murder stood out as markedly different from those earlier robberies. The police found multiple hair samples at the crime scene, including behind the counter and in the restroom. Her clothing was discovered in the sink of the women's bathroom, suggesting a struggle had taken place. Investigators considered three possible scenarios. First, Nancy might have forgotten to lock the front door. Second, she may have known the perpetrator and let him in voluntarily. Or third, the perpetrator may have had access to the building and his own key. Rumors about the murder of the pizza shop employee spread rapidly throughout Austin, especially impacting other Pizza Hut locations in the area. All employees were warned about the potential danger. This horrific incident shocked the community, from the victim's family to residents across the city. Everyone was desperate to know who could have harmed Nancy, and the public urged the police to quickly apprehend the perpetrator. Police began investigating whether Nancy had any known enemies. At just 20 years old, she had no ties to criminals and had never been in trouble with the law. Nancy was a kind and well-liked young woman from Fort Worth, Texas, known and loved by many in the community. No one expected her to become the victim of such brutal violence. Just before the tragedy, Nancy had married Todd DePriest, a member of the United States Air Force. At the time of her death in July 1987, the couple had a daughter named Sylvia. Nancy's co-workers were devastated by her murder. They described her as a kind, friendly, and devoted young woman who deeply loved her family, especially her husband and daughter. As a manager, she was well respected by her colleagues, who saw her more as a friend or sister than simply a supervisor. There were no complaints about her work ethic or leadership style. Investigators first explored the possibility that the attacker had a key to the restaurant, which led them to examine both current and former employees. All Pizza Hut locations in the area used the same key system, significantly widening the pool of potential suspects. Initially, the police focused on the restaurant owner who had discovered Nancy's body. Everyone involved had solid alibis, and no suspicious activity was found among the staff. One of the initial suspects was Nancy's husband, Todd. He had a strong alibi. After dropping Nancy off at work, he went directly to his own job, which eliminated him as a suspect. This left investigators confused about who could have attacked Nancy. Her family insisted that she would never open the door to a stranger and was always careful to keep the doors locked, suggesting that the attacker may have been someone she knew. Amid growing pressure from the public, complaints and demands for answers poured into police headquarters. Community fear escalated, particularly on November 9th, 2 weeks after the murder, when the restaurant on Rint Street reopened. Pizza Hut's management instructed employees to stay alert, monitor customers closely, and report any suspicious behavior. That same day, restaurant employees contacted the police about 2 individuals who were acting suspiciously. These men turned out to be Christopher Ochoa, 22, and Richard Danziger, 19, both employees of Pizza Hut at different locations. A security guard observed that the two had arrived in a car, sat in the parking lot for a while, and then entered the restaurant to order beer. The young men barely spoke and appeared to be surveying the pizzeria in a suspicious manner. When the security guard approached them, he was unsettled by their comments about Nancy's murder. Christopher and Richard asked whether there were any suspects in the case and questioned why there hadn't been any security on duty at the time of the crime. The guard asked Richard where he had been on the day of the murder, and Richard replied that he had been working at a different Pizza Hut that morning. Richard also speculated that multiple people might have been involved in the case. The 2 men then raised their beer bottles in a toast, which the guard found strange. Disturbed by their behavior, the security guard informed his colleagues, who subsequently contacted the police with their concerns. The police quickly identified the two young men and checked their alibis, which were confirmed. They could not have been at the restaurant where Nancy worked at the time of the crime. The conversation between the young men and the security guard was revealing. It's possible that Christopher and Richard were simply frightened, working at similar restaurants and fearing for their own safety. This might have prompted them to discuss the case with the guard out of concern rather than guilt. Christopher and Richard were immediately considered the prime suspects. This was likely due to mounting public pressure and the lack of other viable leads. They seemed to fit the profile the police were looking for. Both were familiar with the restaurant, likely acquainted with Nancy, and had access to the building via keys. They also had reputations as responsible young men, college students who worked at Pizza Hut to support themselves. Their loved ones refused to believe they could be involved in such a brutal crime. A police officer named Sergeant Hector Palanca joined the investigation. Though he had a reputation for solving every case he worked on, there were also rumors surrounding his methods. Some claimed he abused his position and used extreme tactics to extract confessions, including physical violence. According to various accounts, Hector had repeatedly beaten suspects to get them to talk. During a conversation with Hector, Richard mentioned that he had heard from co-workers that Nancy had been shot in the back of the head with a .22 caliber pistol. He also recalled hearing that a blue apron had been left in the sink, blocking the drain and causing the restaurant to flood. While this information was widely circulated among employees, Hector viewed it as highly suspicious. He became convinced that only the killer could know such specific details, particularly the color of the apron, ignoring the fact that all employees wore the same uniform. Despite Hector's suspicions, there was no actual evidence against Richard. His co-workers confirmed he had been working at another location on the morning of the murder. As a result, Richard was released, though suspicion continued to hover over him. Police next approached Christopher, who was working at a Pizza Hut in a different part of town. They brought him to the station for questioning. Unlike Richard, Christopher faced a much more aggressive and coercive interrogation. Officers subjected him to hours of pressure, using intimidation tactics and repeatedly warning him about the death penalty, which is legal in Texas, and the possibility of physical harm. Christopher cried during the interrogation and tried to assert his innocence, but this only seemed to strengthen the officers' determination to break him. They escalated the pressure, threatening to imprison him with violent inmates at the Palanca facility and suggesting he would be subjected to sexual violence unless he cooperated. Terrified and exhausted, Christopher eventually asked what he needed to do to avoid that fate. The answer from police was simple: confess. In a moment of panic and desperation, Christopher gave a false confession. He claimed that his friend Richard had committed the murder. The police recorded the statement, and although Christopher believed he would be allowed to go home afterward, he was instead taken to the hospital for hair, blood, and DNA sampling. Then he was told he could not leave because he had signed a statement implicating Richard and was now considered a potential target. Christopher was placed in a hotel room under supervision and not allowed to leave. The next day, the police brought him back to the station. This time, they told him that he was no longer a witness, but a suspect and an accomplice in the murder. The nightmare began all over again. Once more, they demanded a confession, this time on video. Under intense pressure and without legal representation, Christopher repeated the fabricated story. He claimed that during the attack, he had been waiting in Richard's car near the Pizza Hut where Nancy worked. According to the police version of the story, it was Richard who abused and murdered Nancy, then stole the cash. Christopher, who had not eaten, slept, or had proper access to water in days, was now denied a lawyer and subjected to a lie detector test. He was forced to answer only yes or no questions, completely unaware that the test results would be manipulated or were perhaps meaningless from the start. As a result of the polygraph test, the police falsely claimed that Christopher had failed, using this as another tactic to intimidate him. They then escalated their accusations, stating that they believed he had been inside the pizzeria during the murder and had actively participated in the crime. The officers asserted that the purpose of the polygraph test was to prove that Richard was the mastermind, while Christopher had acted as his accomplice. Despite the relentless pressure, Christopher continued to maintain his innocence. The police then presented him with a grim proposition. If he told the truth, he would receive a 60-year prison sentence instead of facing the death penalty. He was also told that good behavior could lead to early release. But if he refused to cooperate, they warned, he would be sentenced to death. Christopher's answers were recorded on tape. The police were more interested in securing a statement that fit their narrative than in finding the truth. They asked leading questions and heavily implied how he should respond. At one point, the recording was paused. Officer Hector then dictated the answers he wanted before resuming the recording. This manipulation continued for hours, and though Christopher still resisted, he was mentally and physically drained. The pressure intensified. At one point, a chair was thrown against the wall in anger. Eventually, Hector resorted to a tactic he had used in a previous case. He typed up a written confession himself. Christopher, broken and exhausted, simply signed the statement. After hours of coercive interrogation, Christopher was taken to the county jail. Over the past 24 hours, he had endured more than 20 hours of questioning, been isolated for a week, and was held against his will in a hotel room. Despite the clear signs that his confession had been coerced, it was treated as valid evidence. The document, now considered an official confession to Nancy's murder, stated that around 7 a.m., Christopher and Richard had gone to the Pizza Hut with a .22 caliber pistol, entered the restaurant using a key, found Nancy alone, tied her up, assaulted her, and shot her in the back of the head. Before leaving, they allegedly turned on the water to flood the scene and destroy evidence. The day after this forced confession, on November 15th, Richard was arrested while visiting relatives. He was charged with murder and faced the death penalty. Authorities claimed they had solved a brutal crime, and public statements were made declaring that the community could now feel safe. Meanwhile, police continued to pressure Christopher, stating that they had sufficient evidence to prosecute. In reality, their only piece of evidence was Christopher's coerced confession, obtained through intimidation, threats, and mental manipulation. On November 21st, Richard's lawyer, hired by his family, began challenging the confession's validity, arguing that it had been obtained illegally. Around this time, the prosecution introduced DNA evidence. They claimed the biological samples found on Nancy's body could not rule Christopher out as a possible contributor. This interpretation was misleading. DNA testing in the 1980s lacked the precision of modern methods, and the results were not conclusive. Even though the test did not prove Christopher's involvement, the prosecution still presented it as supporting evidence. Richard continued to assert his innocence and struggled to understand why his friend would testify against him. The prosecution also claimed that a hair found at the crime scene matched Richard's, yet the forensic findings were inconclusive. The report noted that the collected material was not a follicle, making the analysis unreliable. The wording used in the report was nearly identical to that used for Christopher's results. While the hair sample suggested a possibility that it belonged to Richard, it could not be definitively confirmed. Despite this, the prosecution used the ambiguous data to strengthen their argument. In the end, the outcome of the case hinged largely on how the prosecution framed the evidence. The Supreme Court's decision relied heavily on the confession, despite its questionable origins, and on forensic interpretations that were far from definitive. The troubles for the young men did not end there. Christopher's family was unable to afford a private attorney, so he was assigned a public defender. In his defense, Christopher stated that his confession had been extracted under unbearable psychological pressure by the police. The assigned attorney showed little interest in investigating this claim. Rather than defending Christopher's rights, the lawyer advised him that his only chance to avoid the death penalty was to plead guilty. Christopher was also asked to testify against Richard. Shockingly, the defense attorney showed little inclination to defend Richard and instead aligned himself with the prosecution's narrative. He seemed convinced of Richard's guilt and went as far as opposing further investigation, even questioning the validity of forensic evidence. In a conversation with Christopher, the attorney referenced an alleged witness who claimed to have seen Richard at the crime scene, another unverified accusation added to the already flawed case. Worse still, the attorney falsely informed Christopher that his fingerprints had been found on the murder weapon, threatening him with further charges. In reality, no weapon had been recovered by the prosecution. Nevertheless, on April 6, 1989, Richard was charged with armed robbery and abuse. He faced the possibility of a sentence ranging from 5 to 99 years in prison. At the same time, Christopher believed that the prosecution had shifted its theory of the case, now suggesting he had pulled the trigger. The state seemingly had enough questionable evidence to charge Richard with murder, but Christopher, acting on his lawyer's advice, decided to plead guilty to first-degree murder. His cooperation spared him the death penalty and resulted in a life sentence. Richard's trial began on January 22, 1990, drawing significant public attention. The courtroom was packed, and the atmosphere was tense, as many sought swift justice. Both young men were brought to court wearing bulletproof vests due to concerns for their safety. After a brief deliberation of just 7 minutes, the jury found Richard guilty of abuse and related offenses. He was sentenced to life in prison. Nancy's family expressed satisfaction with the outcome, believing justice had been served. More than a year later, the truth began to surface. Richard had been wrongfully convicted. While incarcerated, he suffered a brutal beating that left him with a traumatic brain injury so severe that part of his brain had to be surgically removed. Though he survived, Richard was left permanently disabled. At only 22 years old, he was transferred to a long-term care facility where he would receive round-the-clock support for the rest of his life, unable to live independently. The fallout led to increased scrutiny of Detective Hector Palanca. On that pivotal day, the leadership of the Austin Police Department finally turned its attention toward him. Multiple colleagues came forward, confirming that Hector had long abused his authority, employing violence and coercion to extract confessions. Disturbingly, video evidence even emerged showing him physically abusing a suspect. He was removed from duty, but shockingly later reinstated. He would go on to harass both guilty and innocent people for many more years. The damage Hector caused to the justice system is almost beyond comprehension. In just this one case, his actions resulted in the wrongful imprisonment of an innocent young man and left another permanently disabled. And still, the case remained untouched for nearly a decade. The Nancy DePriest case had long been considered closed. No one dared question it until 1998, when a man named Akim Marina came forward. He sent a letter of confession directly to the governor, pleading for his claims to be taken seriously and asking the authorities to contact his lawyers. In his letter, Akim provided crucial information that could help investigators locate physical evidence. He revealed that the handcuffs and bag used during the assault could still be found at his parents' house. He also mentioned that the gun used to kill Nancy had already been seized by police during one of his prior arrests. For once, the authorities listened. The governor's office forwarded the letter, and a fresh investigation began, finally bringing a glimmer of hope that the truth might prevail. After reviewing the new information, police were able to confirm the claims made by the real criminal. With additional evidence retrieved from the archives, investigators approached Christopher, still serving his sentence in prison. Initially, Christopher was skeptical of their intentions, suspecting that they were trying to frame him for yet another crime. As a result, he stuck to the false confession he had previously given under the influence of Officer Hector Palanca and offered no useful information. Eventually, Christopher learned the real reason for the visit. Akim Marina had sent a letter to the governor confessing to Nancy's murder. That revelation gave Christopher a glimmer of hope. Perhaps the truth would finally set him free. Still, his faith in the justice system had been shattered. In June 1999, he reached out to an organization called the Innocence Project. In a letter, he described the injustice he had endured. Once activists from the project contacted authorities, the district attorney reopened the case for review. In August 2000, DNA samples were collected from Akim, whose guilt had finally caught up with him. Multiple rounds of testing confirmed what Christopher and Richard had always known. Akim had abused Nancy, and neither of the imprisoned men had anything to do with the crime. Ballistics tests also matched the bullet that killed Nancy to a gun previously confiscated from Akim during an unrelated arrest. The findings stunned everyone, including Nancy's grieving family. As a result, Officer Hector Palanca was fired from the force and retired soon afterward. Authorities officially announced that the case would be re-examined. On January 16, 2001, a Texas court overturned the convictions of Christopher and Richard, two men whose lives had been irreparably damaged. In a moment that moved many in the courtroom to tears, Nancy's mother sat beside Christopher's mother and held her hand. Christopher took the stand and admitted that under immense pressure from Hector, he broke down and falsely confessed, dragging his innocent friend Richard into the lie. Akim Marina also testified in court. He explained that he had murdered Nancy after being compelled by what he described as voices in his head, which demanded a human sacrifice. He confessed to stealing a work uniform from another restaurant in the same chain and wearing it on the day of the murder. Nancy had let him in, believing he was a fellow employee coming to help. Once inside, he pulled a gun on her, demanded money, and forced her into the bathroom. There, he brutally abused and murdered her. According to his confession, Akim abused Nancy 8 times before shooting her in the back of the head. During the trial, Akim claimed he had heard voices since childhood, which only ceased after he converted to Christianity while in prison. He expressed deep remorse and stated his desire to atone for his crimes. Though the prosecution initially sought the death penalty, they ultimately agreed to a sentence of life imprisonment. The judge sentenced Akim to 3 consecutive life terms. An investigation was launched into the conduct of the 3 officers who had interrogated Christopher and Richard. None of them faced significant consequences. Christopher and Richard were officially exonerated and released. Their families were overwhelmed, equal parts relieved and heartbroken. Christopher later shared that he would often cry at night in his prison cell, unable to comprehend why he was there. Both men had maintained their innocence from the beginning, but no one had believed them. The families were furious over the 12 years of wrongful imprisonment that had destroyed the young men's lives. Their attorneys filed lawsuits against various entities involved in the injustice. Richard was awarded a total of about $10 million in damages, $9 million from the city, $1 million from the county, and $250,000 from the state. Christopher received $5.3 million and overcome by guilt for having implicated his friend. He voluntarily gave $500,000 to Richard. Unfortunately, Richard's condition never improved. The traumatic brain injury he sustained in prison left him with permanent disabilities. He required lifelong care, battled mental health issues, and had only partial motor recovery on the left side of his body. Surrounded by loved ones, Richard passed away from cancer in 2021 at the age of 50. Christopher, on the other hand, began to rebuild his life after his release. He pursued higher education and eventually became a lawyer. Committed to helping others avoid the fate he had endured, he provided free legal consultations to those in need. Details about his personal life remain private.